Now, you also need to know the effects of statutory interpretation. You do need to read up a little bit more on these, but I'll just explain them as we go. So the effects include developing a new precedent. So obviously, we talked about this that if an act is lacking or something is missing or there is no existing act for a judge to follow, of course, in that instance, that fulfills that criteria for creating common law. So whatever that decision that the judge makes, it's going to become a new precedent under the doctrine of precedent that will have to be followed in future cases. So precedent or new common law being created is one of the potential effects of statutory interpretation. Another one is that the words or phrases in acts are given meaning. So obviously the meaning or intention behind an act or statutory law is clarified because the judges have interpreted it and what Parliament meant by it. Also, the scope of legislation can be restricted or expanded. So whether the judge takes on a more of an activist approach, wanting to expand the law, or a more restrictive approach, wanting to narrow it down, depending on how they actually conduct their statutory interpretation, they might restrict or expand the scope of that legislation. So similarly, if we look back to the Brislin case, it's a really good example for what we're talking about. Here we can clearly see that the scope of this legislation was expanded because they took other like services to mean a very broad term referring to any technology that comes along in the future. Okay? But similarly, the scope of the legislation could have been narrowed if the High Court had interpreted that other like services may only refer to specifically services that are postal, telegraphic, or telephonic that are in some way very, very, very similar to the services already existing when this legislation was drafted. In that case, Brislin would have won this case, okay, and would have not been charged with an offense.